Okay, actually it's very interesting you started by talking about raising one's voice. Uh, it's been quite difficult talking about this topic for me as well as younger people, so I think we want to share a conversation about all of that. And I'm sorry, the technology, which is fantastically powerful, also leads to me not having a zapper or whatever it's called to change the slides. So I'm afraid it's going to be a bit of a joint action with Heather over there. So what I'm going to talk about is misogyny as a context as well as a concept of feminist sociology and critiques of the ways in which the relations between men and women in generally and in higher education developed, and around forms of feminist activism. Secondly, I'm going to give a kind of live history of the two books that I'm talking about as a way of contextualizing the concepts of misogyny and patriarchy and sexism. And in particular, the life history starting from a book that came out a couple of years ago called Feminism, Gender and Universities. So the two books are, one is called Reclaiming Feminism, Challenging Everyday Misogyny. And I want to talk about how uncomfortable in some ways I felt about that as a subtitle. It was published by Policy Press in the summer. And secondly, a kind of complementary but separate book called A Feminist Manifesto for Education that's just come out, published by Policy Press. And then I will draw some reflections and conclusions about misogyny as a feminist activist academic. So first of all, about life history as a feminist method. And I think it's quite an important way in which many feminists in sociology and in education have used life history as a way of uncovering evidence that's not routinely in the international and or public policy and legal domain. However, the term misogyny, it seems to me, is a very contested term in academia. But I want to thank the US presidential hopeful, Donald Trump, and his transgressions and outspokenness and vulgarity, actually, about his everyday sexual harassment and groping of women, because he's now brought the term very much into the public spotlight. And so the term is used a lot now in ways in which it never was in the past. Although the actions were there to the actions of men like him were an everyday experience for many of us, and probably more than is still known about. However, misogyny as a concept, it's only been used, I think, routinely in the second decade of the 21st century. Hitherto, amongst feminist analysts, and still amongst many feminists, the term patriarchy, sexism, or hegemonic masculinity is a much more common concept and notion, or one that's beginning to be used much more in the United States, I think, than in this country, the notion of toxic masculinity. And all of those concepts depend a bit on theoretical orientation. Misogyny as well, still seen somewhat as an emotive term, although I think importantly it focuses attention, and thanks to Donald Trump much more so, on abuse, harassment and violence against women and girls in ways in which patriarchy and sexism did not. They tended to be more about structures of relations more generally, though that might be something we want to debate after the discussion. Thank you. Well, this is just to illustrate the ways in which the term misogyny is now, some examples of it. On Monday, October the 10th, I happened to pick up the Evening Standard, and it said, if Hillary wins, you'll see a lot of unleashed misogyny. And it referred to an interview with Tina Brown, who is a kind of liberal feminist. She's an English woman who spent her whole career in the United States, and now she's a very close friend of Hillary Clinton's. But she's edited lots of international women's magazines, and her view of the prospects of the future, which she could also refer to in the interview as boorish misogyny, if Trump wins. And if he doesn't, what will happen to all that unleashed, or rather what will happen given that at least 30 million Republicans supported Trump's campaign. And the argument was, and I think this is quite a helpful argument for our discussions, the extent to this was what she called an American civil war. I actually think it's a very uncivil war. Secondly, The Guardian a week ago had both an article, a leader article, and the leader itself. And the actual article that had this headline, Trump is a vile misogynist, but he's not the only one, I thought was an interesting headline. It was about for an article written by the Guardian's columnist Jonathan Friedland, and it had the byline, victory for Hillary will not be enough to defeat the torrent of sexism unleashed by this campaign. So similar discussions about the extent to which sexism and misogyny are now on a public agenda, at least in the United States. He then went on to argue within the body of his article, fate conspired to pick perhaps the most misogynistic nominee in US history. Well, that's possibly questionable. Most evidently misogynistic nominee in history against the first female nominee. And then he said, perhaps that's no coincidence. And in the course of the article, he acknowledged the fact that there was a lot of academic evidence of the everyday nature of both sexism and now what he called aggressive misogyny. But actually, he didn't reflect on the fact that he, mere male, was writing this article, and he himself is part of that kind of culture. And in a way, perhaps his reflections didn't lead him to talk about that he's not the only one. And the whole culture of journalism around all of this, it seems to me, is seeped with these kinds of ideas that until recently aren't discussed quite so explicitly on the public agenda. The second article, the main leader article, was called The Race for the White House. And it much downplayed the misogyny of Trump and argued, just in a part of it, that Mr. Trump, a boastful, thin-skinned millionaire who trades in racism and misogyny. And all of that, I think, is indubitably the case. But they didn't tackle those issues, and yet juxtaposed, as Friedland has said himself, the fact that Hillary is the first female nominee. But they then went on, in a way, to downplay her position in all of this, and her credentials as the first female nominee, and discussed her serious and sustained commitment on issues like education, healthcare and equality. And then a sort of subline that I've highlighted, that she stood consistently on the rights of women, ethnic minorities, children and the disabled. And I think the next bit is possibly true, but I think it needs more unpicking than they're arguing. As the first female president, she would represent a symbolic transformative change in American politics. And I think probably that symbolic transformative change is the important one. These seem to me to be rather liberal sentiments about feminism rather than more thoroughgoing ones. However, I think there is a more explicit analysis of some of these issues, and here I think the raising of the question of violence against women, or nasty women, as Trump has often referred to key figures, including Hillary Clinton. Michelle Obama, in a much, trumpeted speech, well, it is much trumpeted, sorry for the pun there, about how it's an everyday phenomenon, and the kinds of things he said, but it's not usually spoken about in the public arenas in such crude and salacious ways. And in fact, I think she made a really important educational point, which is she saw it as offensive for her daughters to hear such violent and vile comments about women spoken so publicly and accessibly and in such everyday terms, that what became normal to talk in those kinds of ways about women, as if there were no other respectful ways of doing so. And equally, a more radical person in the US, Elizabeth Warren, who was thought possibly to have run against Hillary Clinton originally for this, has raised the issue of being and claiming the term being a nasty woman, and speaking more openly about that in the public arena as being that being a position of abuse about an everyday term. And perhaps today, being Halloween, it's important to talk about that, because the women as witches historically are nasty women. So our discourse and languages are replete with these ways of thinking about women as other than the normal man. Moving on then to the term that Louise Morley helpfully gave me, I think, and I'm very grateful to Louise for using the term misogyny in some of her work. She used the phrase in an article in 2011, misogyny posing as metrics, in an article she wrote in Contemporary Social Science. But she's also written several pieces about that, which has brought out the ways in which there are scholarly approaches to thinking through patriarchy and sexism in a more thoroughgoing way, and the extent to which this is about violence against women and girls, and how to develop and think about these terms for the future, and how to tackle the everyday relations between girls and boys, men and women, within curricula for the future. And I've actually slightly borrowed Louise's term and embellished it a tiny bit, because she called it misogyny posing as metrics, and I think the idea of it masquerading as metrics makes it a little bit more as a kind of, well, I think of it perhaps wrongly as a sort of possibly a game or not, or ways in which it becomes game playing. Okay, so move on now. My Reclaiming Feminism has the subtitle Challenging Everyday Misogyny, and the book is both a memoir and a manifesto for socialist feminism. And my aim in writing it was to produce a scholarly but relatively popular book. I didn't really want to write any more academic tomes, but I think perhaps it is a bit academic in many ways. And the subtitle was suggested to me by the director of policy press when discussing how to market the book. And I was a bit slightly uncomfortable with using it, and so I consulted my son, who is an academic in the United States and who is a political philosopher. And he was rather uncomfortable with the term for an academic book. And given that my intention was not to write an academic book, I decided to go ahead, although I was slightly anxious about using the term because I thought perhaps it for some people it sounded rather challenging. The other book which I've written is a feminist manifesto for education, and this is a more academic book and intended more as a text for sociology and sociology of education. It draws upon a large-scale EU-funded research project, which may become relatively unique if we go ahead with Brexit in this way, because the EU funded research in what was called the Daphne programme about gender or sexual violence, especially of young women. And the whole question of the EU funding of this from 2000, so it's been going for the last 16 years now, it was how to challenge violence against women and girls in the wake of murders of over 25 young women in Belgium in 2000. You may all recall that. And I've discussed that in the introduction in chapter 1 of the book in more depth. The EU programme then has run for 16 years, and it's now in its 4th phase. But our project, which was called the GAP Work Project, was in Daphne Mark III. It was directed by Pam Aldred of Brunel University. There were 4 EU country partners in Ireland, Italy and Spain, and the main lead in Spain shared a lot of the work with a woman called Dr. Barbara Belia. And what we tried to develop were educational practices to teach about sexual abuse and sexual harassment for gender equity, and more broadly for LGBT people, LGBTQI people, as well as young people too. And basically, I guess we were looking at what Michelle Obama has now talked about as a respectful and fair education for women and men, particularly around sexuality, relationships, and the whole question of how to handle sexual abuse and how to challenge it. And the question of how do we develop a curriculum and educate the educators and trainers to provide this kind of education is a very thorny question, and we certainly found it a difficult question across the 4 countries in which we were working. We actually developed only pilot programs that are being further developed now. This is a picture of me that I recently found, along with 3 others. We forgot even to celebrate, but it's a picture of me and my 3 friends who I'm still quite friendly with when we graduated 50 years ago this summer. So it's a rather historic photo as well. So to go back to a feminist, reclaiming feminism. My life history then is an experience of examples of patriarchy and sexism and how we've challenged them over the last 50 years, which I've tried to recount and deal with in reclaiming feminism. But the starting point for these 2 books relate to more recent experience of misogyny, so that's why I want to provide now a discussion on this kind of misogyny, because I think it's important to reveal it, although I still find it difficult to do it, and I want to discuss it because I think the ways in which the publishing world still treats women is different from the ways in which men are treated. And the starting point was how I'd been commissioned to write a book, for a book series on higher education. And it was to be a brand new series for an organisation called the Society for Research in Higher Education. And the ways in which my manuscript was treated is, in my view, an example of misogyny. But for the most part, misogyny or patriarchy is usually kept under wraps. It remains secret. It's a personal matter of hurt. We tend not to share it, or we tend to discuss things in ways in which we try to cool out those kinds of hurt. So I think it's quite important to talk about this, to kind of share these stories, as you were saying earlier, and give voice to these experiences so that we know it's not a unique circumstance for us, but is a shared circumstance. So, just briefly, what happened was I wanted to apply for a research grant when I was retiring, and there are special research grants for emeritus professors that the Leverhulme fund, and I got a book contract in that series because it was necessary for my application to Leverhulme to say I was going to do a piece of research and it was going to be published. And the requirement of the Leverhulme application was to prove that I had the means to publish the work. And in fact, I didn't get the application, and so I decided to go ahead with the research without the funding, partly because I'd already started on it, and also because using email and the internet was relatively cheap. But actually, when I reflect upon it, this was a whole lot of unfunded labour, which was a kind of labour of love for feminist practice and feminist activism. So I interviewed, and for many, it was interviewed over email or Skype or written forms of interview. But I had over 100, I didn't expect to get so many, international feminist or women academics who were both activists and educators who responded to my series of questions. And my analysis then was based upon the notion of waves of feminism, with an emphasis in particular on my generation of feminists involved in higher education, initially for students. And this is a picture of a group of some of us at an AERA annual meeting in about 1994. Gaby, I think, is the only person here who's also on the photograph, right at the back. So I wrote all of this up as a way of, in a particular way, in a particular fine form of analysis. But I was actually, unfortunately, late in submitting the manuscript. But because I was partially retired, it didn't seem that important to me about it. But I broke my left wrist, and I'm left-handed, so that was a real incapacity. I felt that it was a deeply embarrassing moment. I fell over a bollard in France with a dog I had at the time. So I had difficulty writing and typing. But I negotiated an extension for the submission, and I eventually submitted what I thought was very good text. And many friends and colleagues read it, or read parts of it and agreed and wrote comments on it. But having negotiated the contract for this manuscript with, it was a pair of academic editors as well as the publisher who was responsible for the higher education series, who had assured me that he would publish come what may, but it would be better if it were in the series. But eventually, the male co-editor of the series read the full manuscript when I submitted it, because his female counterpart had already resigned, and I was told on the grapevine it was probably because of his sexism. He was a very ambitious young man who wrote 9 comments on my manuscript in an email though, and some of the comments were lengthy, but they ranged from his incomprehension of English colloquialisms, for example, writing Oxbridge rather than Oxford and Cambridge, which he objected to and said that this meant people wouldn't understand what the book was about, or writing Philly rather than Philadelphia. But more importantly, to his critique of the feminist method of using life history and personal experience. But my methods were justified in the book by reference to several international feminist scholars, including the late Professor Olive Banks, who was both a British feminist historian and also one of the first feminist sociologists of education. Professor Jen Martin used the method, Gaby Weiner, who I've already mentioned, and Mary Evans and Kathy Davis, for example. So there are a range of people whose work I referred to in doing this. But he then said that he asked for major changes and said that even if I did them, he might not publish the book. As a partially retired person, I didn't really need the book. I felt I needed it like a hole in the head, actually, and I ought to be doing something other than this. But I did something that I thought was quite daring. So I withdrew the book from the series and eventually from the publishers, after some rather difficult discussions with them as well, about how they were backing a male academic, and had actually promised to come what may, publish come what may. But this is kind of part of the broader picture of where you publish or perish, as the phrase used to be in the, at least in the United States, that if you weren't, I think this has been ratcheted up more now for younger academics, the need constantly to be publishing. So I think it was an illustration of these broader issues. In addition, I had actually published quite a lot with these publishers, and including 2 books that came out as what were called Routledge revivals during the course of these negotiations. One was called Gambling, Work and Leisure, which I'd written with 3 male sociologists or sociology people. And it was actually published the year of all these negotiations, using what now might be thought of as quasi-feminist issues around childcare. And 2 of the main people I worked with were distinguished professors at LSE, so perhaps that's why that happened. But a couple of years later, my book, The State, the Family and Education, was also produced as a Routledge revival. So it was a bit curious that they were refusing to publish a book of mine now. No, perhaps the downgrading of my what I thought was a radical, it was in a series called Radical Social Policy, The State, the Family and Education. It had a bright red cover at the time. It's now published last year, downgraded to a green, a modest green colour as part of a Routledge revival. Anyway, in the event, finding a new publisher proved much more difficult than I thought it would be. But along the way, I decided to do something that academics don't normally do, but I gather most people who want to publish in trade, as it's called. I acquired a literary agent who was a female and feminist-friendly literary agent for an agency called Artulus. And she'd worked with mega superstars such as Anthony Burgess. But actually she found the process of finding a publisher difficult as well. So through 2 distinguished international feminist sociologists who edited a series, I actually got a publisher for the book with no changes at all because of their references. And in fact, working with the male sociologist editor was a very pleasant process. So the book, which is the one I referred to before, called Feminist and Gender in Universities, was eventually published in the summer of 2014. A slight irony to this story is the fact that a year ago, Taylor and Francis bought up Ashgate, and so my royalties now come from Taylor and Francis, and I feel that's a kind of up yours to Routledge and their misogyny in not accepting my book for publication. However, there was a problem in my view, with publishing with Ashgate. That's the cover of the book. Oh, I should mention on the cover here is it's a picture of a cheer seminar in December 2013. It's in the back. It's not easy to see on this version. Valerie and Louise taking the cheer seminar, which was on feminist reflections on the Robbins report, 50 years on. I took the photograph at that seminar. So the book has been reviewed very well internationally, several distinguished feminists writing about it, but it's only in hardback, and that was only what they would ever publish. It cost £60. And I felt rather upset that it was so expensive. And my withdrawing of the book from Routledge was only possible because I didn't have to worry about my academic career or about dealing with this sexist context. And also the vagaries of things like the Research Excellence Framework and the Teaching Excellence Framework. And the increasing pressure on academics as we've moved from a system of social democracy to neoliberalism. So I was very fortunate, but I feel that it's important to tell this story because of how difficult and how aware I am of how there is this remaining misogyny in the forms of neoliberal higher education today. And that's the overarching argument of reclaiming feminism, that I'm trying to argue about how, even though we thought it was difficult 30, 40 years ago, the kinds of feminist arguments we were able to mount are relatively easier than they are today in this world. What I felt I was trying to do in developing reclaiming feminism, and what I wanted to do, I feel is rather like the approach of a London taxi driver, which is having the knowledge, London taxi drivers have the knowledge of London in their hands, and I wanted to provide the knowledge of feminist activism in academia over the last 50 years from my own personal point of view, not from everybody else's. So that is the kind of argument I've developed. But it proved much more difficult than I imagined, and my agent never found a suitable publisher. And it was rejected even by Virago, who published a book that I was associated with, the Bristol Women's Studies group, Half the Sky, an Introduction to Women's Studies. And it was the first women's studies book that was published by Virago. Incidentally, there is a programme about Virago on television tonight at about 10 o'clock, because they were the first women's publisher in this country, and it's a history celebrating Virago as a publisher. But Virago as a publisher actually, as recounted this morning on the radio, see themselves not as publishing academic or non-fiction, but only publishing feminist fiction, which is an interesting turn, since what the argument I'm trying to make is the importance of trying to uncover feminist evidence about the nature of our wider society, which is usually more difficult to reveal in fiction than in non-fiction. That's a copy of the cover of Half the Sky. Okay, so as I was finding this difficult, the question was whether I should self-publish or move on, or and I didn't want to self-publish because I thought it was, and perhaps this word is too strong, but somewhat demeaning at the end of an adequate line. But I wondered whether I should move on and do something different, and do something like Gaby has done in her recent beautifully published Tales of Loving and Leaving.
Which is self-published.
Which is self. Oh, is it? Oh, I didn't realise. I think her story is more dramatic than mine, despite her modest claims of it being about ordinary people and ordinary people's lives. This is a picture of its cover, I think. Yes.
Thank you.
My
mum and my dad.
Sorry?
My mum and my dad.
So, but the second book then, I got published by Policy Press because they're a leading social scientist. And actually, I hadn't wanted to publish another academic book. I know I didn't want to write in this vein, but it's proved inescapable, and perhaps that's the perils of being an academic. I had published 2 books with Polity before, one with Madeline and Gaby, and the other one, Parents, Gender and Education Reform. And they did, those are the 2 books, and but they asked me for a pithy, short, 60,000 word text, which was to be mainly about my EU project, with a discussion and contextualisation around it about the sociology of gender and education, and a setting of the legal and social context of that. This is a picture of a book by Anne Oakley that came out in the summer of 2014, 14, I can't remember now, which was published 2014, which was published by Policy Press. And it's an excellent personal and political analysis of her father, the late Professor Richard Titmuss, and her relationship with him and his work in the Department of Social Administration. She refers to her father as living in the blue plaque house, and is very deferential about his distinction. But actually, I think she's a more distinguished feminist sociologist. And actually, she writes in the book about the everyday sexism, both by Titmuss in his department at LSE, and in their relationships, and in her family relationships. And actually, I found the book really moving, and I wanted to emulate her. And Policy Press agreed to publish my Reclaiming Feminism, which is an attempt to represent feminism and misogyny. So I've ended up, this is a picture of me recently with Ali Shaw, the director of Policy. I've ended up with writing 2 complementary books, having not wanted to write either. And I see them in a way as linked with my children, as a sort of pairing of them. And just, I just want to end with another bit of story of contemporary misogyny. Reclaiming Feminism was reviewed in the Times Higher Education as the book of the week, and the reviewer said that part of my argument was the white male remains legitimately in power. And I think that is what I'm trying to argue. A week later, I want to talk about this UEL, University of East London seminar, which was called about the TEF and the REF and what the effects are on higher education. It had been organised by Terry Kim, but was postponed until July the 6th, ironically, because of industrial action about funding in higher education at UEL. And the panel that Terry had organised was composed of myself, Peter Scott, who is the professor at IOE, and Dr. Heather Mendick. And there was a fourth person to be on the panel, and that was a man eventually called Dr. Andrew Gunn, sorry. Dr. Jack Grove of the THE attended the seminar and wrote about it the following week. So yeah, in the July 12th issue of the Times Higher Ed, there was an article about the panel, and it referred entirely to Andrew Gunn and to Peter Scott. And there's the quotes from what Jack Grove said. And so, emboldened by the fact that my book had been reviewed the previous week in the Times Higher, I wrote to the editor of the Times Higher Ed, and I'll just read out my note. In this week's THE, Matthew Rice reports on David Feldman's experiences of being misrepresented in the public sphere. Meanwhile, Jack Grove reports on a research symposium about the effects of TEF on staff, students and others held at the University of East London. He mentions only 2 of the 4 contributors to the symposium and completely dismisses the contributions of myself and Heather Mendick. This is a clear example of not only women's voices being misrepresented but silenced, or what I call misogyny masquerading as metrics. This is John Gill's reply to me. I wrote to him as the editor, as well as to letters to the editor. He says, I'm sorry that you feel you've been silenced. I wasn't at the event, so I can't give a personal view on the news judgment Jack made about what you to report. But I can say with complete confidence that there is no misogyny from any of my reporting team. News judgments will always be that, judgments. And while others may disagree with them, it's inevitable that we will pick particular lines of argument from a debate to report on. And this often means that only some of the participants are quoted. His view was this was a judgment. So Heather wrote back to him and asked him. He didn't publish my letter, and that was the end of the story as far as I was concerned. But Heather wrote to him, hey John, thanks for this email. I've published summaries of Miriam and my contributions to the round table on a blog, linking to the THE article and mentioning the focus on male contributors. I think people may be interested to read about your response to Miriam's letter, which speaks to how these decisions are made. Would it be okay for me to add this to the blog? And his response was to say yes. But I think that represents another element of misogyny in higher education today, that he says that's his judgment, but the judgment is clearly to exclude the women's writing. Okay, can you just skip to the last slide now? Okay, but sorry, is that the last one?
I'm not sure.
So I just finally want to say what I've been trying to do in both these books is to develop an argument about the past and hopefully for the future. And I feel like it is time to let future generations, as Emily was arguing earlier, talk about the future. But I'm delighted that Pam Aldred and colleagues have got an extension or a new EU-funded project to take forward the work that I report on in a feminist manifesto, and they're allied with Alison Phipps's Changing University Cultures project here at Sussex. And I think that that's wonderful that these things are being taken forward. And finally, I want to say a huge debt of gratitude to Louise for her feminist friendship and for cheering us all on against the continuing misogyny.
I'd like to ask a question, which is, for me, how do you differentiate between legitimate criticism of your work and sexism? Yeah. Particularly when you're writing about, or if it's about other issues, right? How do you, that's what I want to know, how do you differentiate? Because we've all been knocked, well, all of us have been knocked back in different ways. And how do we recognise what forces are working at what particular time to when we do get rejected or we do get, yeah, so that's my question.
Are there any others?
Yeah.
I also have a question regarding the research you've done already. And I'm wondering what was the method you used and what were the questions that really popped up in the whole process of analyzing it.
Rebecca.
I'm really interested, Miriam, in placing misogyny within particular bodies. I wondered whether you might say more about that, class, race, transgendered bodies, how we recognise, how we misrecognise them. Sorry, how we unpack it.
Okay.
I was thinking about life histories and feminist methodology and whether we can say there's been this big move in recent years towards evidence-based policy making, which I interpret as being prioritising a male form of knowledge, and how this has come to pass and what we can do to push back against it.
Okay, brilliant. That's probably enough for you to think back to, or I think that's a part of it. But I think your emphasis is really important. What we can do, I think, is really, really powerful to comment on if you can.
Should I work backwards about life history versus evidence-based policy making? I often think it's the opposite of that for policy-based evidence quite often, that although it's talked about as evidence-based policy making, very often the evidence is very selective for the kinds of policies that have already been decided upon. So the perspective of the policymakers does need to be taken into account. I think life history is not just one person's life normally, and I think what I've tried to do, and I think most people using that method, and I think that relates to your question as well about method, is not just to talk about my own life alone, but as it's part of a generation of people in similar or different contexts, and the ways in which those mesh together to gather and reveal kinds of evidence that are very often not brought together in that kind of way. So it wouldn't just be, and amongst that kind of work is about gender, race, ethnicity, and so on, and class being part of it. So it's not just life history, but it's contextualised life history as a method, which means that it's more than just the unique individual. And I think we can draw from that kind of qualitative work an approach to looking at a broader picture. Bodies and recognition, misrecognition about misogyny, sexism, and so on. There have been a number of groups of feminists who began to develop that kind of analysis. There's a variety of kinds of pressure groups, like the Feminist and Women's Studies Association, Gender and Education. So there are bodies that are pursuing ways of countering the traditional approaches to the kinds of ways in which evidence is collected and developed and so on. And is that the kind of answer to that question? I think, was it you? Oh,
It was
sorry.
Rebecca.
It was you,
Sorry,
Rebecca, yes.
I suppose Sarah and I were having an interesting discussion about the term, really, misogyny, and you were very interesting to begin with, Miriam. You talked about that you'd chosen it rather than particular other terms, and you were discussing why that might be particularly pertinent, so it grew out of that. I suppose we were taking more of a post-structural take on this and thinking about if we don't assume that we can know that body, that misogynist body, or what happens if we can't necessarily make those assumptions? Can we make those assumptions?
There have also been a lot of debates about the essentialism embedded in the term misogyny, hasn't there? So particularly in some of the discussions on transphobic misogyny, in some of the hostilities that trans women have experienced are now being discussed in terms of transphobic misogyny. So I think it relates very much to that. Is there an essentialised agenda in the concept itself? Do we need to broaden?
Yeah, that's what we were wondering. What does it add to, rather than using terms like patriarchy? Because we were wondering whether it kind of fixes it onto the individual body, the male actor, rather than. But obviously, what we were trying to do is connect it to the structure. So we were wondering what were you said that you were uncomfortable using it at first. What were the limitations that you found in using this?
Well, I think it does individualise, it doesn't deal with the broader structures. On the other hand, I think it draws attention, as I was trying to say, to a form of patriarchy that has been talked about in feminist circles for years, but is not addressed until very recently around the question of violence against and violence against women and girls and possibly boys as well. And that's why we talked about LGBTQ as well in our thinking project. And I think misogyny there is a helpful way of opening up a broader discussion about patriarchy, because discussions about patriarchy very often about the power structures that suffuse with male, class male, white male positions, which don't always address the question that is really important in my view nowadays, which is about the actual overarching violence within a lot of that behaviour. Not just symbolic. To answer well, I don't have an answer to Gaby's question about what's legitimate and not legitimate criticism, but given the review process and things being reviewed, I think we use the review process as a way of doing it. Publishers use review as well as journals using review. So what I was arguing about was how things have been reviewed before. If you mean the
No, I just meant when we submit anything, you know, if it's feminist or overtly anti-racist or whatever, and we know that we're going to hit problems.
No, I'm just saying.
How do we recognise what is legitimate criticism, that i.e. that it could be better written in this way, and what is? I mean, that's been a problem for all of us. You know,
Yes, of course
all
it
of
has.
us.
I was just addressing it in one particular concept. But what I'm saying is that the review process may produce those legitimate or not legitimate criticisms. That's what peer review is all about, isn't it?
Okay, let's take another couple. You had your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, it was a really question.
It's a comment, that's fine. Yeah.
It was just on the discussion around the use of misogyny as a concept, really. Because I think it can be used structurally. I mean, you can use that kind of William's idea of a structure of feeling, but actually what misogyny allows us to get at as a way of understanding what is going on now is that kind of feeling, that emotion, and it's anger. It's anger, and it's violent anger, and it's hatred. And I think the challenge for us as feminists is to think, well, how do we deal with that both on an everyday personal level, but also see it as a structure, which has material consequences.
Yes.
So that idea, so Ahmed's idea of what's it do? These are feelings, but they're doing things in the world. How do we sort of weave them all together? So just
No, that's fine. I think Hannah came to that question.
Yeah, which is actually more it's a sort of question to myself, I think, really. But it's I've been thinking a lot about how do we know what's being criticised when our work's being criticised and it's about our own personal experience, it's reflexive, it's part of our own political project. And what happens structurally when our subjectivity, our personal politics informs our work, what's getting criticised and who gets to decide how we unpick that. One of the concerns I've got is that there's a bit of a kind of buy one and get one free going on. The Academy gets my activism for free. It gets my feminism for free when it pays for my labour. And that happens within a particular structure. And the reverse of me having my personal as my starting point for my politics is that structurally that means my politics becomes personalised. It becomes an individual attack on that individual piece of work, or the hurt feelings of rejection. And so I wonder, I don't want to say we should just never talk about feminism at work, that's the solution, but how do we deal with that absolute structural contradiction that our feminism is at the heart of our professional ability, and yet at the same time can be used to marginalise and demean the silencers in the very processes that present themselves as objective, fair and just based on judgment. Thank you.
Does that raise that's brilliant. Does that raise any comments or thoughts for anybody else? I want to take as many voices as possible. Yes. Okay. Back.
This is actually a comment on the question. So we discussed about intersectionality. We think that misogyny can happen to different people with different race or groups of people in a different way. So, obviously, your presentation and your life story is valid as an example of misogyny culture, but also considering that you are white and you are you speak English as your first language, you still have the privilege that people with different race and different backgrounds couldn't have. For example, like me, I'm not white and I don't speak English as my first language. I also get discriminatory. For me, it's discriminative in this institution in Sussex. For example, I get a lot of comments from my work. Of course, I realize that my work is not as perfect as your work, like your academical, because I'm still learning. But like a lot of comments about my language, like you should polish your English. There's also a kind of like discriminatory practices in higher education. So we discuss a lot about like the challenge of higher institutions and of course feminist movement to make sure that in higher education, like people who often marginalized in daily life could also have voice in the education is also important, and it is the challenge in the higher education. So yeah,
that's wonderful. And I think that really relates back to what you were saying, Rebecca, this notion of who constitutes a critical feminist voice and how is that embodied, and how kind of what you were saying, the boundaries and how they shift and how they get politicised between who you are as an academic, as an activist, and how that works within a space to produce particular kinds of knowledge, which then become contested. And I think all of those points drew out to themes really nicely. We've only got a couple of minutes left, and Miriam, is there anything you want to speak back to, or is there any other points and claims people want to raise in the room?
Just a very quick one. Misogyny posing as measurement argument. I mean, one of the things I've noticed about misogyny is that it constantly migrates and mutates, and it gets quite abstract and quixotic. It's difficult to capture, and it often hides behind the structures, the very sanitized, the very disembodied structures like metrics. So there's no misogyny because everything is counted, everything is fair. That email exchange that you had, no, there's no misogyny there. It's just that some people were some people's contributions were more interesting than others, etc. So there's something about how the dominant group's interests keep getting reproduced and protected, and the hatred that you described, the sort of vitriol, the visceral, the affect, gets subsumed behind this very sanitized discourse of it's all out there. And I think it would relate to your point about criticism, that is seen as an objective engagement, and that has got nothing to do with bodies. So that it's all absolutely transparent and fair and carefully negotiated. And the misogyny keeps hiding behind this stuff. And the current structures that we have in higher education, they favour the dominant groups. Whatever the location, whatever the identity, they favour the dominant group, they favour the elite. And misogyny is hiding behind that at the moment.
I think it's really important, some of the work that is happening on campus that Frida discussed at the beginning, and some of the projects that you're doing, the continued ways to challenge those misogynies that are experienced at the everyday level. I think the everyday word is really, really important. The things that sometimes happen and then you need to reflect back on them, they go unnoticed. The things that suddenly you feel uncomfortable and you can't quite constitute why you feel uncomfortable.
I think
and it's those naturalised experience at that level of affect where you suddenly go, hold on, something didn't sit right with me. Rather than
in sociology, we used to use the word normative, but actually, I think it's much easier if we use the word everyday. It becomes the usual, the natural, and we do accept it. So actually, a lot of the time, we can't even feel angry about the level of hatred, or even if it's just symbolic violence, but it is meant to use a Algerian term. The violence is kind of ever present, so and it's very hard to resist it. That's why I felt I did want to talk about it here, even though I felt uncomfortable about doing it and frightened about doing it, to be honest. So I know how much worse it must be for you, for example, not being white, not speaking English, to be able to express that. But for so long, I covered up, I pretended it wasn't happening, and so on. That's why I thought it was important for this to become a shared experience, so that we can keep being activists in the academy, even if it's they're taking our unpaid labour to do it. I mean, I don't want an academy that doesn't allow us to speak out, really.
We have a question from our online participant.
Yeah, it's a comment actually. A lady called Sandy, who was only able to join for the last 6 minutes. She missed most of your presentation, unfortunately, because she wasn't able to log in. But she says she found the example of who gets highlighted in a summary very familiar. She says also, I went to a conference about a week ago where no women were all over, chairing, introducing, organising, while most of the keynotes and panels were 3 or 4 men, 1 woman. Took me back to the 70s.
Yes, back to the future.
Okay, I think we should draw today to a close. Thank you so much for all coming and to see so many of you here, and I think it's really powerful that we are here. Thank you to Miriam for speaking and for sharing an example of the ways in which misogyny works at all levels.